Hi everyone, welcome to Launchpad, an initiative by Newton School, where you can learn about industry-ready technology for free. This is the course on Introduction to React, and we are today having a lecture 4. In previous lecture, we have learned what React is and how React works, and like what are the internal working and how React makes everything fast, and what are the core principles of React. We also learn about state and props, and also learned about component and component lifecycle. Okay, so basically the component that we have learned till now are called class component, and there are also one thing called functional component in React. So functional component are just basic component which are written instead of using class. They are written as a JavaScript function. So if you go to our this code, let's say this one, and try to make it a functional component. So what we have to do is function. Then as we name the class something, we'll name this also. And if there are any props that's going to come, we will get it as a parameters. So that would be parameters we are having. And then basically the difference between a class component and a functional component is, in a class component is a set of defined methods that need to be there. Like a render must be there, and if you want to have something in did mount, then you have to have those. In functional component, you do not have any thing like this. So like basically, if we just go back to our previous code. So here you can see the component did mount is present, and component did update, a component will unmount. These kind of things are not accessible in functional components. Okay, in functional component we use something called as hooks. We'll look into it later on, but for now just we'll try to make our first functional component. Okay, so it's just a normal JavaScript function which take parameter called as props, and here whatever we want to return, like whatever the UI that we want to show, basically whatever the render of a class component is basically that's what you will do in the functional component. So the return in the functional component is same as whatever the return inside the render function of a class component. So basically, if you look at this and just take this one only and copy this here. Comments. So basically, we got ourselves our first functional component. Okay? So it's basically simple as that. And if we just save it and let's start our server, and we'll start. And you can see whatever you have seen in this class component will be same as in this one. We just need to remove this props because it's not a class. So we'll just remove this because there is no this inside a function. So by the meantime it's starting, we'll just look what changes we have did. Basically what we did is we created a JavaScript function which have props, and we return a JSX, which what we want to display on the browser. Okay. Now the only difference is this keyword is not needed here because it's a function component, and we are getting props directly as a parameter. So we could use directly props.url or whatever the props that you have passed. Okay. So let's just go on the browser and look at it. And if you can see, this is our contact component, and this one this is rendered same. So like if we do here increase the value, it will also change because props are handled correctly. Now if we have to these components are called stateless components. state by stateless component because they don't have any states. They can only use probs. They do not have any defined state. Okay. So basically, before React 16, we did not have any way to make a functional component very like useful or very like self-dependent. Okay, because we do not have any way to set state. So like if you try to do set state here, so let's say just make a function here, phones, and this, since we do not have any this object and we will not have this dot um, this dot set state, and let's say count. Now, if you see, then we are having an error because set state is not a method defined inside a function, like it's not having any property like set state. And since this is not a class component, so it does not extends a React.component class, which by default gives you access to state and this dot set state. In this, we do not have anything like set state function. Okay. So this was previously a major drawback for using functional components. So previously we used functional component would be used only just to make very simple static components. They do not have anything very complex that, because we cannot use state and other things that we wanted to. Okay, or we cannot use other component lifecycle method. We do not even have access to component did mount here because this is not a class component, so we cannot use this also. Okay, so basically this was the problem with functional component previously, but now React has mended that with something called as React hooks. Okay, so what are hooks? Hooks are nothing, just they are also functions. Okay, they are just JavaScript functions. What they do is they allow us to use React component lifecycle and React state and refs and other things without writing a class component. So let's just use our app component, which has some state and which does some calculation in the state. So we use this and convert it into a stateful functional component. Okay, let's just comment it out. Okay. Now, basically, just what we're going to do is we're going to make it as a function app. We can have props if any props are passed, and then we'll just make first a render function. Okay, so whatever inside the render function will be inside the return statement we have, and that would be this, and then this is our first. This is our first function state. Now we will render other component here also. Contact. Then we have URL. And then we had account. Okay. This. Now in this count variable, we cannot have this dot state dot count. Now what we have to do with the count variable, we understand pretty in the next step. Let's just make our render function first, and then we have about, and then we have a button which have an on-click attribute. Now we cannot use this because this is a functional component, so we have to remember that we cannot use this here. Handle click. Okay, and then we will use something as count here. Okay. Now to define state, we use a hook called use state. Okay, so it is directly imported from the React. So if you do go here, if you just use the React.use state, you can access that. or it's since it's a named import in the React module. So you can do is use state import. Just we can import since it's name import, we can import it as using the curly brackets. Okay, so we'll just use the named import one, use state. Now what use state does is use state returns us two things. Actually, basically it's an array. So use state is um, use state is basically an array. It returns what the state is, and it also returns a function which will you will be using to set the state. Okay, so just to give you an analogy with the React class component that we have learned previously, we have to divide the state, define the state, initialize it with some variable in as an object. Like a state is an object of variables whichever we want to keep inside the state. Okay, and now in this one, use state returns you a variable which is the state. Every for every use every time you use state, you will get a variable which is the state, which is the state that you're going to be using, and you're also going to get a function which is going to set that state variable. Okay, and it also takes one other thing, the initial state. So remember, we have to initialize this so that we can get anything, at least something rendered for when we first, when the component is rendered first. That's what it is. The initial state is same as the initialization process. So let's just go ahead and initialize this as one, and just change this as count, because this is our count variable, and we're going to change as set count. Now, set count is the same. Set count is analogous to set state. So whenever you are doing this thing, set state count and this thing. So what you were doing is using set state function, and inside the state you were taking the count key and updating the count key with the current of the current value increased by one. Okay. And now you can do the same with the set count. It just makes it very easy. Like you don't have to write this dot set state and then type in the key name. You can just use set count as a function and do that. So let's see how we do this. So we're going to define a function for. So we can first just write what where we have to use this count. Okay. So we have to pass this the count variable. In here we what we did, here we passed it as a this dot state dot count, because this was inside the state a key that we have to that we can access as a count. Okay, but here we have directly as a variable because we have destructured it. Now you can always do not destructure it, but it's a good practice to destructure it so that you don't have to use dot keyword dot operator every time. Because it can get like make when your state is big, you have to use dot multiple times, and that would be like cumbersome. So we will just use count here, and we also needed to use here because we have to show on the button how many times you have clicked. So we are just going to do this. Now we're going to make a function called handle click. Handle click, what handle click is going to do, and just going to do the same thing, which is going to set our state and set a state for the count variable. Okay, so let's just go in there. Const handle click. And now you must be thinking, why defined a function as a const? Because since it's a function, we cannot define it directly like this, because this is not a class. So we have to define it as a variable, and that variable is having a arrow function, having an arrow function. Okay. So what we have to do, we have to set the count variable. Okay. So we will use set count function because this function allows us to set count variables value. Now, always remember, do not set count variable directly in the code as in like count is equals to count plus one. This is bad practice, and it is not the React way to do it, because it can make other side effects which you do not want. Like it can create some other bugs and side effects. Okay, so always use the second thing that is returned after use state. So we're going to use set count variable. And in the set count variable, what we have to do, we have to increase the value of the count variable by one. Okay, so we use the existing count variable and we take its value and increase it by one. So if you can see, the amount of code that we have written in this thing is pretty less, and we were able to do way too many things with our code. Okay, so this was the same code that we have written for this, and this is the same code. Like in this, you cannot see a difference because there are only just a couple of lines. But when your codes get bigger, when your component is bigger, this will make a difference because we don't have to write these big declaration and big things like that. Okay, so it makes a bit difference because code is more readable and code is like a bit compact. So what these things are, these things like use state, and you will learn something called as use effect. What these are called, these are wrappers or an abstraction layer over the class component. So previously we had the class component only. Okay, in which we can have an state or we can use component lifecycle methods. But now we can have these, and how we have these is we using these something called as hooks. Hooks are just an abstraction layer over the things that were in the class component. Okay? So let's just now look at it, our first class functional component, and let's see if it works the way we want it to. Okay, so we just refreshed it, and let's just see. So what we did, we set the count value as a prop, and we on this click we also updating the count value. So let's see if it works or not. Okay, so you can see it is working pretty fine. Yeah, it's working the same as the one with class component, because there is no difference in a class component or this component. Just the way you write it and this, just the way you do some things are different. Okay, so you will be saying when these things are useful, like when you have to write a class component or when you have to write a function component. You can write both of them in your code if you like. If you so basically the idea is to shift from this class component to functional component. But as you will see in the industry, there are companies which are using class component exclusively, which are using, and there are companies which are using functional component exclusively, and there are companies which are using hybrid approach. They're allowing the developers to write with in whichever way they want to write. Okay, so there is no hard and fast rule where you have to use it, but as a rule of thumb, if you understand the concept of hooks and how hooks work and a functional component, then try to write your component as a functional component, because it makes the code more compact and it's more in line with the future the future the way React wants to go. Okay. So this was our first hook called use state. Okay, so this is one of the most important hook basically. So just to recap what we did, use state is hook. Hook is just like a function where you can pass value and it returns something to you. Okay, it's a normal sort of normal JavaScript function. And now one more thing, always remember whenever you encounter hook or whenever you are designing your own hook, a hook always has a signature. The hook name always has a signature called use. So whenever you see a use before a function or something, like it might be a hook. Okay, so like use state or use effect, use ref, there are different hooks which are present in React by default. So this is a hook which mimics the state and set state of our class component. Okay, it returns an array. Array have two variables. First is the state variable that you wanted to define, and the second is the function which you will use to set that state variable. Okay. Now there is another hook called use effect. Now, if you remember, we discussed about this component lifecycle method: component did mount, component did update, component will unmount. Okay, these type of functions. So now you would be thinking, how can I access these methods in a functional component if I don't have access to them in that? Like, what was the use of function component then? How would I access? Like, how would I make an API call before the component get render, or after first render on mount? Okay, so React developers also think about that, and they have developed a hook called use. Okay, so combined with useState, this hook is these two hooks are the most important and the basic hooks of your React functional component. And same as useState, you can import it as a named it is a named export, so we can just use it as a just we can just access it directly. We can just import it here. And now, what this does is use effect always takes a callback function. Okay, so it's a callback function inside that, and what it has two parameter basically: a callback function. So if I just this boilerplate code, so use effect have a callback function. Uh, Always take a callback function and an array of input list. Now, what these two things does? Okay, so let's just go and dive into it. What callback function does is uh, callback function is the function that will be triggered based on the input list. Now, what does that mean? So, if you remember in this one, like in this component did mount was triggered only when component was mounting. Component did update was triggered when props changes or state changes. Yeah. So, and component will mount only be triggered when the component is removed from the DOM. Okay. So what the input list is same. So input list defines when it has to call the callback function. So input list is like the trigger point. Whenever you want to trigger the callback function inside the use effect, you have to think what the input going to be, and that's how you're going to do that. Okay, and there are so what you can do is there are some technicalities to it. So basically, if you do not pass this, okay, if you do not pass the input list array, what will happen is the callback function will be triggered every time. So let's just go and look into the action. Just make a callback function and just alert, hello, I am triggered from without input list. Okay, let's just save it and see what happens. Okay, this was triggered basically first time, because first time the component was rendered. This will be triggered. Okay, so we have now it will be triggered every time the something changes in the component. Okay, so let's whenever we click, there is a change. There is a change because the state has changed. Since the state has changed, so the re-rendering will happen. Now, since you might be getting confused, what is re-rendering here? There is no render function here. Now, what render function was doing, the same was happening here inside your return state. So it has to change based on these variables. Now, state will change based on these variables. So what happens is your component gets re-rendered again. Now, what things that will not happen? So everything inside the component will get triggered. So in this use effect, since this does not have an input list, it will also get triggered every time anything inside the component changes. If it's a prop or if it's a state, does not matter. Okay. So let's just see more things in action. So Whenever I make a change, it will show an alert because we have not specified when to call the callback function inside the user. Okay. Now, if we pass an empty array, what will happen is it will only be triggered once the component is once when the component is getting mounted. So remember, component did mount here. It was only triggered when the component was getting mounted. Same effect will be having by this. So what will happen is it will only show alert when the component gets mounted. After that, it will not show alert ever again until unless the component is remounted, which will be happening if we remove the component, then it somehow gets into view also. Okay, so let's just see this. If we save it and just go in the browser, so it is triggered first time, and let's just change the input. As you can see, it will not show alert because we have specified an empty array list, means only get triggered when the component gets mounted, not after that. Okay. Now, one more thing we can do is we can pass the items that will cause this to mount. Oh, sorry, that will cause this callback function to to call. Okay. So just for now, we just assigned it the count variable. Okay. So what it will do? It will not be triggered when the component is getting mounted. It will only be triggered when the count value is changed. So whatever inside the input list is going to make the change. So like just suppose you had another variable also. Let's just first see what will happen in this one count. Okay. So now this will get triggered first time also because here we are changing the count value first time. It was 1, so it will get triggered first time. But after that, it will only get triggered whenever we are changing the count value. Okay. So we change the count value, it will get triggered. We change the count value, it will get triggered. Okay. Now, if you pass another variable, let's just make a state also, const. Show. So just make it false for now. And show dialog. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we only going to display this thing when we are going to set count, but we only want to display the dialog thing only when the count is even number. Okay. So what we have to do, if count plus 1 mod 2 double equals to 0, then we will set show dialog to true. Otherwise, what we're going to do is set show dialog to false. Okay. And we are setting the set count as same as that. Okay. Now, instead of count variable, let's just say set show dialog. Okay. Now, whenever we click, and if the value is even, it will. Okay. It's not getting triggered. Oh, sorry. I have instead of using the variable, I have used a function, and since function's value never changes, so it will not cause it to re-render. Okay, so let's just refresh this, and whenever it goes to even, it will show. Now the thing here is it is showing on both because both the times the set show dialog thing is getting changed. Okay. Now, so if you want to avoid that, we can do is just like a normal function. We can just make this have a condition if only show when the show dialog thing is true. Okay. So since show dialog is initially false, it will not be shown. Whenever it goes to 2, it will show. It goes 3, it will not show. On going to 4, it will show. Okay. So we can in the same way we can pass the count variable also. Now whenever we pass the count variable, it will always going to be triggered. It is going to be triggered like so let's just add a log here. I am triggered because count was changed. Okay. Now just going to also look at the logs also. So these are logs. Whenever we change the count, the thing inside the use effect, so the use effect callback will run every time because anything inside these parameters change, the input parameters that you have given, like input array, anything inside that change, the callback will be triggered. Okay. So let's just see that in action. So basically, we're gonna do this. This was triggered because we are the count is even, yeah, and if we just look at this, you can just see this is also getting triggered every time. So hello, I'm triggered user effect, and this is also getting triggered. So anything inside the user effect will get triggered whenever the anything inside the a parameter list or like input array change. Okay. Now one more thing is so basically what we have learned is whenever we want to mimic the component did mount is so we can use make a user fact which will not have any input parameter. So basically what this will do, this will behave same as component did mount. Okay. Now when we want to use make it as a component did mount, sorry, component did update. So what we have to do is pass in the input parameter based on the which we want to change. So it can be props, it can be state, whatever you want. Okay. It will change. It will be same as use. Sorry, component did update. Okay. Now one thing that remains is what will happen to component will unmount. How would we do the component will unmount? So the React developers are also given one thing from us, one thing for us, and that is if we look at the boilerplate code that we have. So whatever you return from the use effect hook, whatever you return from the use effect callback, that thing is act as a cleanup. So what that cleanup means? So uh, let's just say we have some effect. Let's just take this effect only. Okay. Uh, we have this effect, and we are returning an arrow function which says console.log. Now, since we cannot unmount it, let's just check. So to see that thing, what we're going to do is we're going to do this thing in our contact component so that we can easily understand what is going to happen. Okay. Now, so we're going to make a use effect, and here effect is something, something. Let's say I am mounted props that are props.count and props.ui. Okay, and we only want this to run when it is mounted, and we want to return a function which says console.log I am unmounted with props.count. Okay, just import it here. So this will be a component, and now what we want to do is we just want to make sure that this component gets unmounted from this. So show dialog. And what I have done is I've added a condition that if show dialog is true, then only show the contact component. Otherwise, do not show the contact component. Okay. So let's just see what happens. Okay. Now, when we change, whenever we want to change this, I'm mounted with props this. Okay. Now why? Why this console log was happened? Because what we did in the code was show dialog. If show dialog is true, then only render the contact component. And when the show dialog gets true, when the count value goes to even number. Okay, so it goes to true. And now we have to make sure that this component gets unmounted. And whenever this thing goes to an odd number, this component is not in the DOM. So what React does is it unmounts that component. It unmounts that component, and when it unmounts, it triggers whatever the callback that we have returned. So inside the use effect callback, we were having when you get mount console this, and when you get unmounted, return a callback function which have I am unmounted with props. Okay, so whatever you return inside the callback of use effect, that is our cleanup. So that basically behaves like a component will unmount. Okay, so let's just also look at with the this example that we used. Now in this we used did mount to you add an event listener of key down. So let's just do that. And in this, what we're going to do, remove event listener. Key down. And then now we have to make a handle key down function also. We just going to make that. And this is our component did that happen. Okay, let's just refresh this page up, and let's just see what happens when our component get mounted. Okay, so as soon as this value goes to 2, our component gets mounted, the contact component gets mounted. Okay, whatever is in the did mount gets executed. Okay, so now if I do a key press, you can see a console. You will see a console. Okay, so this the console is happening because I'm pressing the key. Okay, Now, as soon as the component is unmounted, this key press event will not fire, and you can see the console will not come. Okay, let's just remove these consoles and increase our count value. This is unmounted. Now, if I press the key, you can see no key press logs are coming. Why? Because you have returned inside the cleanup that whenever my component get unmounted, do a console log and remove the listener of key down, which is handled by handle key down. Okay, so this was how functional component mimics component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. Okay, so till now what we have learned, what is the use state hook, and we also learned what is use effect hook and how does it work, what are input parameter, what is the callback function, how do we perform cleanup after our component gets unmounted, and how updates will happen whenever the counts are getting changed. Okay, so one more thing. So if you remember in our last lecture, we learned about something called as ref, and used something called as react.create_ref to create a ref and then use it to access the element whichever we wanted to access. Okay, so we also learn we will since we do not have access to create that here, we have to use hook only. So like inside the functional component, you have hook that handles our react.create_ref functionality, and that hook is called as use ref. Okay, so what user ref is? User ref is same as the create ref, react.create_ref. It is imported as a named import from here. Okay, and how will we update it? We can use this user ref. Now user ref is takes an initial value, which you can give a null also, and returns a ref variable. Okay, so let's say our first ref. Okay, this is our first ref. Now we can just use as we used in the class component and just point our first ref with this. And if you wanted to console log whenever update happens, so we can just do that. Now, if you remember, the react.createRef also made an object. Object has a value current. Okay, so that's what we are console logging, because this current key contains the div element. So like the way we used to do with document.get element by ID, we get the reference to this. So we used to get the reference to this div and anything inside this div, its children, its properties, its attributes, everything. Okay, so in ref, what your ref variable name is, dot current gives you the same thing. Okay, let's just see this in action. Going to browser, and if you look at this here, you can see this is our div that we have that we use the ref for. You can see that it has a child nodes, p, a div, and then a button. Okay, and so you get everything that is accessible inside this div. That whatever the elements that you get, you can access them. Okay. Now, one basic difference between this user ref and react.createRef is so we use current property to access that element. Okay. Now, in react.createRef, the current property is immutable, so you cannot change its value once it's set. Like you cannot set it directly by yourself. Like you can do it this way, but you cannot do this like. Our first ref dot current is equals to something. Let's just say anything. You cannot do this because this is basically an immutable property. Okay, you will get error in the console. You can see the error, and but in this thing, you can access the current variable and you can update its value. So you can make a current variable to be like an array, and suppose whenever you want, you can push inside this array. So let's just suppose you have multiple element getting rendered, and you want every each and every element ref. So you can do that in this. So you can just use this and push inside. Okay. So this was our user ref function. Uh, and regarding hooks, and so like it's just not it is not mandatory to like use functional component. You can use class component also. And if you think that there is some task that you could do with a functional component, but that hook is not present. So like say you are making a form and you want some custom thing to be happening. Uh, so you can also make your custom hook. You just need to make sure that your hook have a name used in that. Okay, so first three characters should be used, and after that whatever you want to have, you can have it. Okay, so this is a naming convention that we use in React, and you should follow it because it's just easier for anybody reading your code to understand that this is a hook, not a normal function. Okay, and uh, so that's about it regarding the functional component and the hooks. So we have learned the basic hooks that we want to get started. Uh, that we can get started with the React functional component, use state, user fact, and user ref. And there are multiple hooks. There are so many hooks like use memo. There is a hook called use memo for something called as memoization. There is hook called as use callback, and then there is hook called as use um, reducer and other things. So there are multiple hooks, and whenever you're dealing with big projects, so they will be using a Redux and other things. So they will have their own hooks also. So you get to learn like by looking at the documentation how this hook works and how what parameter it takes and what it returns. Okay. So that was it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll use whatever we learned up till now and make a tic-tac-toe game in React. Okay. Thank you everyone for your time.